Yesterday, the United States levied new sanctions on Russia for failing to negotiate in good faith, a move that Russia says both doesn't matter and is also an act of war. Now, this marks the first Russia sanctions package of the Trump administration, and it's already happened. Not in 2 weeks or 30 days. They're in place right now, and this is a really big deal. This is no doubt a step in the right direction for two main reasons. First off, the sanctions being in place today means that they are already going to have a direct impact on Russia's ability to continue this war over the long term. The second piece here is the symbolism. Look, and we've hammered it on this channel. Since Trump came into office in January, there have been no concrete steps taken to actually pressure Putin to negotiate. That changed yesterday. Look, there's been a lot of up, down, sideways. I would even argue one step forward, two steps back at times, but we can't gloss over the fact that this move laid out yesterday by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is a positive step in the right direction. Here's the Secretary talking just before the announcement was made about what brought them to this point.
President Putin has not come to the table in an honest and forthright manner, as we'd hoped. There were talks in Alaska. President Trump walked away when he realized that things were not moving forward. There have been behind-the-scenes talk, but I believe that the president is disappointed at the where we are in these talks. So either this evening or first thing tomorrow morning, we are going to be announcing a substantial increase in Russia's sanctions. I'm not going to give you the exact sanctions, but I can tell you that this will be one of the largest sanctions that we have done against the Russian Federation.
Now, the Treasury Department put out a statement saying, quote, "Today, the U.S. Department of the Treasury is imposing further sanctions as a result of Russia's lack of serious commitment to a peace process to end the war in Ukraine. Today's actions increase pressure on Russia's energy sector and degrade the Kremlin's ability to raise revenue for its war machine and support its weakened economy. The United States will continue to advocate for a peaceful resolution of the war, and a permanent peace depends entirely on Russia's willingness to negotiate in good faith." I'll have the Treasury Department note linked in the description below for anybody that wants to dig into the nuanced details of those financial sanctions. President Trump was asked about this during a meeting yesterday with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Here's what he had to say about the new sanctions.
Today is a very big day in terms of what we're doing. Look, these are tremendous sanctions. These are very big. Those are against their two big oil companies, and we hope that they won't be on for long. We hope that the war will be settled. We just answered having to do with the various forms of missiles and everything else that we're looking at, but we don't think that's going to be necessary. We would like to see them just take the line that has been formed over quite a long period of time and go and let's go home. Last week they had almost 8,000 soldiers killed. Many Russians were killed last week. Many Ukrainians were killed last week. We think it's ridiculous and would like to have it end.
Now, turning back to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who said, quote, "Now is the time to stop the killing and for an immediate ceasefire. Given President Putin's refusal to end this senseless war, Treasury is sanctioning Russia's two largest oil companies that fund the Kremlin's war machine. Treasury is prepared to take further action if necessary to support President Trump's efforts to end yet another war. We encourage our allies to join us and adhere to these sanctions." Now, a couple quick notes there. First off, the language here, the change in language is notable and important. All of a sudden, we are seeing senior U.S. officials say the problem here is that Putin is refusing to end this war. We can't overstate how important that is. I think it's a little bit silly that here we are 9 months, 10 months into this administration, and that's kind of a win. It's ridiculous that that was ever really up for debate, but that's a big step. It's a positive step, something that we should be happy about. Again, this is something that is not just a positive for Ukraine, actually coming down against Russia and punishing them for what they've done, or at least imposing costs on their desire to continue this war, is good for U.S. national security, short and long term. Now, Secretary Bessent asked that our allies step forward and contribute to, or at least follow these same sanctions. They are. We have just yesterday the European Union announcing their 19th sanctions package shortly thereafter. Here we have a video from Kaja Kallas, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, as well as the Vice President of the European Commission, talking about that 19th package.
So today we have a long day ahead. a few very important points. First, we are going to adopt the 19th package of sanctions, which has a lot of important points regarding energy, regarding financial institutions. It is all meant to deprive Russia from the means to fund this war. We also are very happy about the signals we get from America regarding the sanctions regarding Russia. I think it's an important sign of strength that we are aligned here. And of course, we're going to discuss the reparations loan as well. There are some issues still that we need to cover, but I think it's important. The fundamental message is that Russia is responsible for the damages caused in Ukraine and has to pay for those damages. And the frozen assets we have, and the reparations loan, on the basis of that for Ukraine to defend itself. It sends three very important signals. One is to Ukraine, that we are supporting them to defend themselves. The other one to Russia, that they can't outlast us. And the third one to America, to show that we are taking very important steps ourselves. And of course, today we are also going to discuss our own defense. What more can we do? Here for Europe, it is important that we see defense as joint value, and we also do joint projects to defend our region. Thank you.
Now, some added details here, as reported by Newsweek. They say the European Union has approved its 19th sanctions package against Russia, including on its lucrative gas sector for the first time and its shadow fleet, to heap pressure on Moscow to end its war in Ukraine. They say the sanctions introduced the first ever EU ban on imports of Russian liquefied natural gas, forbid all transactions with the energy companies Rosneft and Gazprom Neft, and blacklist an additional 117 vessels from Russia's so-called shadow fleet, which Moscow uses to circumvent the price cap on Moscow's seaborne oil. Now, we are already starting to see an impact here, and something to keep in mind is there's a couple different ways that sanctions take hold. One is immediate, like the threat of sanctions or the actual follow through could technically prompt a reaction by Russia. Like for months now, it does not look like the United States is getting ready to do anything serious here. The fact that we actually crossed that line and those sanctions are in place is a meaningful message. There's a very short-term window here where Russia might respond to that, ideally by deciding to come to the negotiating table. The other side of sanctions is more long-term. So it's not that we're going to see some direct impact on the Russian war machine next month, next week, or even the next 2 or 3 months. It might be more drawn out than that, but that is kind of the long tail impact of sanctions. So short-term, the fact that they were put in place. Long-term, the actual impact they have. We are starting to see a response already from some of Russia's key allies. According to Reuters, they say privately owned Reliance Industries, an Indian company, will stop importing oil under its long-term deal to buy nearly 500,000 barrels per day from Russian oil major Rosneft after the oil producer was sanctioned by the United States. So the economic impact here could be very, very immediate, but how that trickles down into the actual execution of the war is something that we should expect to take a period of time. Now, before diving into the Russian response here, which is all over the map, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Delete Me. So here's a fun little story for you. A few weeks ago, a company called Healthcare Services Group announced that a data breach had exposed the personal and health information of 624,000 people. That breach was in September of 2024. And great, they made it public, and now their employees and customers can take the necessary action a full year after their personal information was leaked. And I hope they do, and I hope they get it cleaned up. But here's the deal. You can't wait to hear your data has been compromised to take action because, to some degree, it's happening all the time. And it's not always big breaches like this, but even smaller data brokers that purchase your information online and sell your profile to anybody, no questions asked. With access to this data, bad actors can piece together a profile of where you live, your job, income, religious and political affiliation, and more. And I don't think any of us really want that information floating around out there. I certainly don't. And this is where tools like Delete Me come in. Delete Me is a subscription service that constantly scans the internet. When they find your personal data available for sale, they have it removed. Now, I personally use Delete Me, and here's a look at my most recent report where they reviewed 3,661 listings, found and removed one listing that contained 10 pieces of my personally identifiable information. Then looking back, 11 listings removed in August, 2 in June, and 20 in April. That's why the subscription aspect here is so important. This is the kind of thing that isn't one and done. You've got to stay on top of it, or like I prefer, have Delete Me stay on top of it for you. So if you want to protect yourself and your family from these data brokers, get started with Delete Me today. You can scan the QR code on the screen or use the link in the description, and be sure to use code Preston for 20% off all consumer plans. And of course, thank you to Delete Me for sponsoring today's video. So Russia had a couple different things to say here, some expected, some not, starting with TASS. They said Russia considers the U.S. Treasury Department's sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft to be counterproductive. They say the U.S. sanctions will not cause Russia any particular problems, as the country has strong immunity to Western sanctions, and Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova reiterated that Russia's stated goals for the war have remained unchanged. It's nice that they keep saying that. Just as a reminder, we stressed that in a recent video. Russia has never veered off their original war aims. They didn't veer off it last week when we thought there might be a Trump, Putin, maybe even Zelensky meeting in person. They're not veering off it now as these new sanctions are rolled out. Dmitry Medvedev had a bit of a different take, unhinged, you might say, where he said the United States is our enemy, and their talkative peacemaker has now fully taken up the path of war with Russia. Yes, he does not always actively fight on the side of the Banderite Kyiv, but this is now his conflict, not the senile Biden's. Of course, they will say that he could not do otherwise, that he was pressured by Congress. This does not change the main thing. The decisions made are an act of war against Russia, and now Trump has fully aligned himself with the insane Europe. But there is a clear plus in the next swing of the Trump pendulum. It is possible to strike with various weapons at all Banderite hideouts. When they say Banderite, they're talking about Ukraine, without looking back at unnecessary negotiations, and to achieve victory exactly where it is only possible, on the ground, not behind a desk, destroying enemies, not making meaningless deals. So to really pick apart the second aspect there, first off, Medvedev in the first part saying, this is war, this is an act of war against Russia. The second part, what he's getting at, is kind of suggesting that Russia has been very careful in what and where they strike inside of Ukraine, not to upset negotiations. I think there's, you could probably pull that into question. I think it was just yesterday, Russia struck a kindergarten in Kharkiv, so I'm not entirely sure what targets they're avoiding at this point. Nonetheless, Medvedev laying out very clearly what we've all known for some time, where he says the only way to achieve victory is on the ground, destroying enemies, as in continuing the war. Russia's plan now, and has been continually, I don't know that this has ever changed, continuing the war. The negotiations are secondary, kind of an afterthought. Now, all of this comes outside of what were some additional congressional sanctions and policies that were laid out in recent weeks. I don't believe the sanctions package in the Senate laid out by Senator Lindsey Graham in recent months, that has not come through. It's not been up for a vote, but it could be, and that would be an additional series of sanctions that could add more and more harm to the Russian economy. We need to keep an eye on that. It's another lever we could pull in the near term. However, just yesterday, there was a pretty significant move in the Senate, kind of flying under the radar with all this other news, that they're trying to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terror. That would make, right now, there are only 4 state sponsors of terror under U.S. law: Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Syria. And look, at this point, we'll probably argue that Cuba could come off that list, probably even Syria. But nonetheless, you get the idea. Very few countries get that designation. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee yesterday unanimously voted to push this bill forward. Now, they said the reason for this is because Russia is not returning the almost 20,000 Ukrainian children kidnapped from occupied areas. Senator Graham said these kidnappings by Putin's Russia represent one of the most outrageous events since World War II. Quote, making Russia a state sponsor of terror would be devastating to Russia's economy. It is a necessary consequence of Putin's behavior if these kidnapped children are not returned home. Now, unlike the sanctions that are in place right now, there would actually be a period of time here where they're asking Russia to rectify this issue. They say 60 days after the passage of this bill, and I should note the bill has not passed yet, it just left committee. They say 60 days after the passage of the bill, it requires Secretary of State Rubio to submit a report to Congress certifying that the kidnapped, deported, or displaced children have been safely reunited with their families or guardians. If that does not happen, then the Secretary shall designate Russia as a state sponsor of terror under U.S. law. Again, more pressure. And this is one where it's a big deal. It is. And it's something that we would not have even, it would have been a wild thing to consider just a couple of years ago. But I just want to stress the change in tone. And I know it's exhausting. I'm ready to get hurt again here. You know, we're going to backflip here or backslide before too long, just inevitable. But these are positive steps. We are seeing bipartisan support. The important one here, and we have to be clear, the important one here is we are seeing progress on adding, be it sanctions or in this case, restrictions on the Russian economy through the designation as a state sponsor of terror coming from Republican lawmakers. That is the important part right here. That is the segment inside the U.S. government that has been stalling. There's no other way to put it. The progress there is notable. The change in tone there is notable. It's important. Let's make sure that keeps up. Now, another big thing that was brought up this week that did not come to fruition is the idea of sending U.S. Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. This has been up, down, and this has been negotiated all over the place. And there were a lot of issues with trying to get these into Ukrainian hands, one of which the deployment. We've got some land-based launchers, but not a lot. It's a pretty complicated system, start to finish. Ukraine, no doubt, could figure it out. But there's also a lot of other weapon systems they could utilize like tomorrow if we decided to ship them today. It doesn't sound like Tomahawks are going, at least not anytime soon. But the Wall Street Journal reported that there may have actually been a change in the permission structure for using Western munitions inside of Russia. Listen to this. They say the unannounced U.S. move to enable Kyiv to use the missile in Russia comes after authority for supporting such attacks was recently transferred from Defense Secretary Hegseth at the Pentagon to the top U.S. general in Europe, General, I never get this right, Grinkowicz, who serves as the NATO commander. They say the decision to lift the restriction on Storm Shadow occurred before Ukrainian President Zelensky met with Trump at the White House last week. Zelensky was seeking Tomahawks, which would greatly expand Kyiv's long-range striking power if provided. Trump's rebuff of the request has limited the West's negotiating leverage with Moscow. The key component there, and this is actually another, arguably one of the biggest things that came out yesterday, is the approval process for striking inside of Russia has sat with the Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, for some time now. That's been a train wreck. There were 2-3 instances where Hegseth turned off arms shipments bound for Ukraine, like stopping them at the Polish border, turned flights around over the Atlantic, and the president seemingly didn't know about that at all. He's been completely out of line with the president's guidance at least a couple different times. And there was a report a couple weeks ago saying that the United States, the Pentagon, was not approving any strikes of Western munitions inside of Russia. You're telling me there's not a single target that we could approve? Get out of here. That's ridiculous. So moving that from Hegseth to a U.S. General Grinkowicz, the NATO commander, who when he testified in front of Congress a few months ago, this is a man who said Ukraine can win with the right support and the right sanctions and the right partners around them. He knows the situation on the ground. He knows what those targets can be, and this is a good move. We should expect to see an increase in long-range strikes inside of Russia directly because of that. Now, this was interpreted a couple different ways. President Trump came out saying that this is fake news. This is not what actually happened. In fact, let's play a quick clip yesterday in the White House where he was answering some questions about this specific issue.
No, it said that I gave Ukraine permission to shoot missiles deep into Russia. I didn't do that. Second of all, they're not using our missiles. They're using, I think, European missiles or from someplace, but they're not using ours. And what they do, I don't control that. But I do control our missiles. They're not shooting our missiles in. It was a fake story. Wall Street Journal does a lot of fake stories.
And this is one where I feel like maybe the reporter and the press or the president or something missed each other here. So there was something in here about the U.S. authorizing the use of U.S. munitions inside of Russia. That doesn't appear to be the case. It's the approval process that seems to have changed. And I would argue that's actually a bigger deal. In fact, even Russian media is saying that is the bigger deal. Rybar said long-range Western missiles are not the main problem right now. And this is in a post as all of this information was coming out. They said all of this is not particularly important, primarily because for fear of Russian regions, the main threat comes from Ukrainian drones, which require no permission to be used. And the damage from those drones is significant. Just look at the consequences of strikes on oil refineries. The issue of combating them is largely organizational, but solutions were not rushed even after last year's strikes on oil processing facilities. They say in simple terms, the enemy is causing enormous difficulties even without American long-range missiles. And judging by the continuing impacts of slow UAVs on critical infrastructure, nothing has fundamentally changed in terms of problem resolution. So this is one of those, like, look, would Storm Shadows, ATACMS, and Tomahawk missiles be good to go against some of these deep targets inside of Russia? Yeah, no doubt. Larger payload, longer range, harder to shoot down, for sure. But even coming from Russia, they're saying, yeah, I mean, cool, but those drones right now, the ones that are flying today and that flew yesterday, are actually causing a pretty big issue as is. So again, stepping back, pretty positive day, I would argue. It's been a whirlwind. I know a lot of whiplash in the last couple weeks especially, but this is a good move, not just for Ukraine, but for U.S. national security short and long term. Good news for NATO security short and long term, that we are actually taking steps to layer consequences on Russia for not coming to the negotiating table. The big hope here is that Russia reduces some of their demands. The cost to continue the war becomes too much. We start to see significant economic hardship inside of Russia. Again, that might take a little while to get there. And we actually find a viable end to this war. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.